Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I featured another podcast with Laura's inspirational story, whose dad has been in intensive care since March 2014. You can check out last week's interview podcast with Laura, whose dad has been in intensive care since March 2014 with a subdural hematoma and is not waking up. Listen to Laura's inspirational story by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to show you the perfect excuse why families of critically ill patients in intensive care have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Having a loved one critically ill in intensive care triggers all sorts of feelings, emotions, thoughts, behaviors, and also irrational responses from families of critically ill patients in intensive care. Worst of all, families of critically ill patients in intensive care tend to be paralyzed by fear, frustration, stress, and they allow their vulnerability in those circumstances to get overwhelmed and to get bogged down by negative emotions. This is especially important for you to know if your critically ill loved one is in one of the following often once-in-a-lifetime situations in intensive care where they are very unstable and in a very critical condition, or if they are in a life-threatening situation, or if they are in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or if they have a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or if they are even approaching their end of life in intensive care. Those scenarios also get families of critically ill patients in intensive care to sometimes become cynical. They often lay blame on other people, which more often than not also leads them to be making excuses why families of critically ill patients in intensive care can't have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. It's the perfect scenario for why 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care don't have peace of mind, don't have control, don't have power, and don't have influence. And the sad reality is that it's driven by their own insecurity, by their internal and secret fears, their frustrations, and it can also often be driven by guilt and shame. Those are extremely powerful emotions you and your family are dealing with. And if you and your family don't get a different perspective quickly, and if you and your family don't learn the right tools, arm yourself with the right weapons, and get a behind-the-scenes view about what's really happening in intensive care, you will be like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence, and you will continue making excuses, laying blame, being paralyzed by fear, handing over and surrendering your level of control, power, and influence to the intensive care team is the biggest mistake you can ever make, and it often is a good excuse for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. It also aligns well with the strategy of the intensive care team, who wants you to be passive and not active during this situation and challenge. After all, the intensive care team has a clear-cut agenda to drive. That is a direct result of what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Behind the scenes is where the intensive care team is making decisions. Behind the scenes is where the intensive care team positions your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis. And behind the scenes is where the intensive care team is making decisions about the care and the treatment offered to you and your critically ill loved one. Behind the scenes also means that every decision the intensive care team makes is driven by the power play, the dynamics, the intrigue, the psychology, and most of all by the hidden agendas in intensive care. Behind the scenes also means that the intensive care team looks at those things that are sacred to the intensive care team and that they would never share with you, such as the financial viability of your critically ill loved one's stay in intensive care from the intensive care team's perspective. So that basically means, will they make money or will they lose money by treating your loved one? They are also concerned about the bed status and the bed situation in the intensive care unit. For example, will continuing treatment on your critically ill loved one block a bed for other patients who are in need of a precious and expensive intensive care bed, and does the intensive care team think that other patients would be more interesting to treat, or would they be financially more viable? Also, the intensive care team has medical research interests. Medical research is a multi-million-dollar per year industry, and many intensive care units rely on those revenue streams in order to not only perform medical research on real human beings without often informing them and without giving them or their families a choice. And I know it's not your fault. You would have never guessed that's what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care could be so important for you and your family to know, because the reality and the fact of the matter is that I didn't know either when I first started to work in intensive care. However, after more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, I have gained insights, I have learned lessons, and more importantly, I have literally looked after thousands of critically ill patients and their families, and I have held their hands, I have consoled them, and I have guided them through one of the most stressful, unpredictable, and sometimes traumatic experiences in their lives. I have also looked after many critically ill patients and their families who died in intensive care, and by seeing their heart breaking, I broke my heart too. And I knew I had to find a way out of this dilemma, as I knew that if I can't get it handled when dealing with critical illness, death, and end of life, that I couldn't continue working in intensive care. The good news is that I did find a way out of the dilemma by offering real-world solutions on how to deal with the emotional drama, and more importantly, how you can get peace of mind, control, power, and influence. The reality and the fact of the matter is that if I have found strategies, coping mechanisms, and ways out of dealing with such situations where your critically ill loved one is in a situation where they are either very unstable and very critical, or if they are in a life-threatening situation, or if they are in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, if they have a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or even if they are approaching the end of life in intensive care, you can find ways out of those dilemmas as well, and you can now relax, and you can stop doing what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing, who are making excuses, who lay blame, who may become cynical, and who don't take responsibility for their actions, their thoughts, their feelings, and their emotions. By you stopping to make excuses, by you taking full responsibility for every thought you think, every action you take, every word you say to the intensive care team, every word you don't say to the intensive care team will automatically for you assume peace of mind, control, power, and influence. By you and your family stopping to make excuses why you can't have peace of mind, why you can't have control, why you can't have power, and why you can't have influence, and by you and your family learning quickly what's happening behind the scenes, and therefore counteracting the intensive care team's perceived authority and perceived power, you will automatically assume peace of mind, control, power, and influence. When you and your family stop making excuses why you can't have peace of mind, why you can't have control, why you can't have power, and why you can't have influence, you are getting an unfair advantage, and you will have armed yourself with weapons that will clearly make you superior to the 99% of the families of critically ill patients in intensive care who continue to make excuses, who continue to lay blame on other people, and who continue to choose not to assume peace of mind, control, power and influence. You and your family, however, have made a conscious choice. You know that peace of mind, control, power and influence are within your reach. And if you only learned the right things, and if you only learned what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, so that you can position yourself powerfully and so that you can ask the right questions, so that the intensive care team knows that you are an insider and that you are asking insider questions that will automatically push back on the intensive care team's perceived authority, which is an authority that intensive care teams have relied upon since intensive care came on as a specialty in the medical field in the 1960s and 1970s. It's also an authority that has more or less been unquestioned so far, because families of critically ill patients in intensive care once again have been too busy making excuses rather than taking action. So, how can you stop making excuses, and how can you have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. You learn how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You'll get plenty of real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. How you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section, where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.